So this works, hopefully. Thank you for introducing. So this is a kind of different audience to me because as already explained, I have a background in HTA, not in statistics. So I'm not a statistician. I think that's a kind of disclaimer I would like to make before starting this presentation. Yeah, and what I'm going to actually introduce today is a bit different than I think the first two presentations, and goes a little bit more about what we want to do in terms of using new HTA methods in HTA practice. And it was, of course, a little bit sad that our colleague from Ireland could not participate because he was actually there to set the scene on what is going to happen in the EU HTA, especially on the kind of position on what to do with indirect comparisons. So my talk will be a little bit more broader and really actually focus on a project which has been quite recently started, funded by the European Union on, well, what can we do actually to align all these developments in HTA, including statistical methods, to what is happening in HTA practice. And I think that was already, I think, also indicated in some of the previous presentations, that there is some mismatch between very advanced methods and actually what HTA bodies do. And also because some of these advanced methods might be quite interesting and better, but not always very transparent. So what are we going to do in the future to ensure that what comes up and what would be better to actually see that is going to be used, for instance, by HTA bodies on a national level, but also on a European level. So this project is called Sustain, and it has a very long title, saying an EU-wide initiative to build a supporting infrastructure to ensure ongoing implementation of the latest and fit-for-purpose HTA methodologies and tools and practice. So this project was based on a call of the European Union. So European Union certainly said, well, we want to have a project which actually identifies innovative methods and tools, in particular those which were developed in EU-funded projects, and I will say a little bit on that later on, and also whether they actually going to address the HTA body needs. Also to see, well, what are actually the barriers that these methods are currently not being used? There are new advanced methods and nobody, at least not in HTA practice, is using them. Then can we actually identify some use cases based on the needs of identified HTA bodies, and actually to see whether these methods at some moment can be endorsed by HTA bodies. And subsequently also having an implementation plan. And that implementation plan includes tools, but also matters how are we going to educate the HTA people at the HTA bodies? What do we need to do for that? What is the structural plan for that? And of course, also how are we going to disseminate the activities from this project to HTA bodies, but also to the broader stakeholder community. But I think it's very crucial that if you do such a project, and I think we thought it was not very clearly actually identified, that we say, what are the needs of the HTA bodies? What are they looking for? Because if we're going to develop methods, for instance, by academic groups, and no HTA body is actually asking for it, what's the need of it? So where can we actually find the link between identifying needs on one hand and developing new methods? So just a few things about the project. And I think some of you are probably aware of these European Horizon projects. So a lot of you are aware of what we call research initiatives, which are projects which are actually making new methods, developing new methods. This is not such a project. This is what they call a coordinated support action, which is really meant to implement, to support all the stakeholders, mostly HTA bodies, to see what's around and what can be used. So I think that's important to actually understand, because we're not going to see any new methods being developed by this project. It's a project for 4 years. And actually, the idea is to actually see that this project also develop into what we would call a sustainable system. So a mechanism what after these 4 years ensures that this kind of development will continue. The coordinator is my university, University of Utrecht. So Why are we so interested in this kind of development? So there are many investments in HTA methodologies around EU projects for more than 10 years. And I will give you some examples. So we have seen many of this project. There was referred, for instance, to Get Real. I think Get Real was an important project where we are looking how can we use real world data, real world evidence, also in HTA decision making. Other project, COMET, HCX, there are many around. And still we had a feeling, well, there is a lot of these methods being developed, but we're not sure whether these methods are actually being used. And then also the kind of change in what HTA bodies do. I think historically, I worked for an HTA body more than 80 years. When I came in, we did like assessments of statins. So for big populations, very big trials, and very actually focused on mean results. But now we are looking to very different types of treatments. Very heterogeneous populations, very small populations, very different research designs. So are we actually ready for that? And therefore, there is a kind of perception that development in HTA methodologies actually not match the needs of HTA bodies, and what can we actually do to support that? And also, how can we align HTA needs to academic HTA methods developments? And can we learn from national collaborations between academic groups and HTA bodies? For instance, in the Netherlands, we have something called the Academic Research Network HTA, where my organization, the National Healthcare Institute, actually works together with two universities, Utrecht University and Erasmus University, to really align science with policy. So also ensure that there are questions from our institute that the academic groups really take up those questions and subsequently also work on the implementation of those methods. And I think there are more of these initiatives in some of the countries. I think also UK has a very close collaboration, for instance, with academic groups. So what are the main takeaways of our projects? So we want to become a neutral platform that provides high quality expertise on new HTA methods to meet the needs of HTA bodies. And this neutral is very important. To be quite frank, because some people sometimes think that some of these tools are only invented by others to make our life more difficult. Just to go to, oh, there's another new, very advanced method developed by a consultancy group, and we have no clue whether it works, whether it's transparent, and whether it actually helps us to do our things better. So that is the kind of perspective we have. So we need to be this neutral body. And what we want to do is to actually see what is already there in terms of methods, what are the developments, and how do they match to the needs at the HTA side. And also to see whether we can develop some form of tools which make these kind of new methods more accessible, more transparent. And at the end, we want to support what we call the pan-European HTA workforce and align HTA expertise through a robust education and training framework that can also encourage the uptake of those methods. So this is the kind of basis, and it sounds, it's quite ambitious, I think. But I think we also need something because we feel there is a big gap between what's currently being developed in terms of methods and what is being used. So here we talk mostly about statistics. We have to be clear that this project is more than also only statistics and clinical developments. It's about a lot of the health technology. So it's not only about medicines, but it can also be about medical devices, maybe in the future even about digital health technologies. But I think in the beginning, we would like to focus on health technologies to be perceived complex, and also maybe relating a little bit to what's going on under the EU HTA regulation. So we think we might start small, and we would like to become bigger over the years. And then also in terms of HTA, you know, HTA is a very broad concept. I don't know who of you is aware of the HTA core model. Anybody? Only a few. Well, the HTA core model describes 9 domains, and clinical effectiveness is only a part of it. Cost effectiveness is also only a part of it. So there are budget impact, ethical aspects. So if we want to take this all in account, is massive. So we're firstly going to focus on clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness. And we also think, well, our aim is to support national and regional HTA bodies, but also the EU HTA regulation. So it's not only about the EU HTA regulation, but it's also what's going on the national level. And again, very important that we have to look at the needs which are developed at the national and regional level, but also at the methodological needs which are defined by the HCR coordination group and its subgroups. For instance, the methodological subgroup, which has developed the current guidelines, and we all see these guidelines are work in progress. But it will take some time before these guidelines will be updated. And Sustain HTA, therefore, is aiming to support a future HTA system by close interaction with the HTA coordination group and its subgroups according to their express needs. I think that some of also the people which are in this project are also part of these subgroups. I am, for instance, member of the coordination group and also member of the subgroup on joint scientific consultation. But there are more people in our project which are very directly linked to that work. So who is in this project? And I think the balance of the partners in this project is very crucial. So we have tried to find an alliance of academic groups and HTA bodies. Firstly, the academic groups, they seem to be quite dominated by Dutch partners, but that has also to do with that we wanted to find the partners which were actually coordinating these previous HTA methods projects. So for instance, my university was leading the HCX project, a quite recent HTA project which have been finalized just a few months ago. We have the Bocconi Center, which was responsible for a lot of work on medical devices in HTA. We have, for instance, the Erasmus University, which is currently leading the IMI Eden project. Well, I think some of you will know that. And even responsible for Darwin EU, the Secretariat of Darwin EU. We have, for instance, also in there Get Real. Get Real, we all know because of all the work which they have done on real-world data. And then we have selected a number of HTA bodies from different regions, like ZIN from my country, NICE from the UK, but also, for instance, Agenas from Italy, but for instance, also NOMA from Norway. So we believe that the balance between HTA bodies and academic groups is essential to actually bring this work forward. So just to show you, it's always nice to show the people which are involved. Maybe some of you know some people on this slide. I think, for instance, Anja, which is in the front of the slide, will be familiar to a lot of you. But there are more people with a statistical background in this group, showing that there is a lot of expertise, also sometimes similar, but also sometimes very different, which helps us to bring this project forward. So how does this project look like? So we have four important elements, which are firstly, identification of the needs and also of the new methods, subsequently bringing the needs and methods together, and also find some prioritizations, which needs and methods have the highest priority to actually take forward. Then we have a work package on what are steps to implement, a next work package on education and training, and finally also on dissemination and outreach. And this is, of course, all controlled by an overarching work package. We try to have it simple because sometimes you see like these projects have 10 or 12 work package. We feel we should keep it very small and simple. But under this work package, we are going to do a number of things. So for instance, in this work package or in the identification, synthesis and prioritization, we are going to develop what we call a horizon scanning tool to identify the needs of HTA bodies. And the idea is that we are going to do this structurally every year. So we're going to actually make a tool, and every year again, we're going to ask HTA bodies, what are the needs you have? Where do we need to look for? What kind of methods do you miss? On the other hand, we're also going to set up what we call observatory to actually identify which methods are currently being developed, so that we actually have a link to what is coming in terms of new methods to the needs which are actually being requested by the HTA bodies. Then we have a work package on implementation, which is on the dialogue between academics and HTA bodies. So where can we actually work more closely together? But also something which you might have heard of called the sandbox, where we can actually do some real examples, tryouts, use cases, where, for instance, we have new methods, we have new cases, and we can see, can it really improve the way we do things at the HTA body level? Then the education and training. So we're going to set up an education and training program, but we're also going to facilitate a fellowship program, especially for HTA employees of HTA bodies, which might be a little bit less experienced. So for instance, somebody from an HTA body at the Central and Eastern European country who actually could go for 3 or 6 months to a more experienced HTA body to get experience with certain more advanced methods. And then finally, very important is the business model. How are we going to ensure that this work will continue after the project is finished? And I think that is something which we really need to start from the beginning, because we have to think, well, what will be in such a business model? How are we going to fund this? And you can imagine that if it's something which is being organized for HTA bodies, that might be very hard to do anything with private money. So probably we have to find some form of public funding to ensure that this will continue after the project is finalized. Of course, we are not living in a silo. So we think, well, what can we do to actually collaborate and ensure that what we do is going out to all kinds of players? So firstly, other HTA bodies. As you can see, not all the HTA bodies are currently part of the project, but also to industry and payers, and to regulatory and policy organizations. So we have formulated 3 different fora, which we ensure a very active interaction with other groups outside of the project. So we have the HTA network. I will say a few words on that. We have the expert forum, and that's meant to actually link to other projects which are developing new methods, or other societies, like for instance, ISPOR, HTA, ISPI, so that we also ensure that we have a close link to the scientific community, and then the stakeholder forum, where we try to involve all the different stakeholders so that we also ensure that there is a close interaction. So a little bit about this HTA network. So currently we have HTA bodies in our consortium, as already indicated, but we already have 8 other organizations which are actively involved in what we call our inner circle from all countries around Europe. And we foresee that more HTA bodies will actually join in over the coming year. But we also think it's important, because methods are not only developed in Europe, that we get also involvement of HTA bodies outside of Europe. Think, for instance, of organizations like CADEF from Canada, or ICER from the United States, or the HTA body from Australia. So we have to ensure, because we know that also these kind of bodies actually link to our project, and that we also see what's going on over there. So just to quickly, we don't go in detail, but what are the kind of projects, European projects, which have been going on over the years, of which we think information is relevant for what we're going to do in this project? So a number of projects are there, and we also indicated which partners from our project were involved in this project, and also the type of methods which are actually being developed or assessed in this project. For instance, in the HX project, evidence synthesis, linking RCTs to real-world data, prediction modeling, personalized treatments, or the impact HTA, combining also about RCT and real-world data, healthcare and social costs, HTA for orphan medicinal products, or the COMET project was mostly focused on economic evaluation of medical devices. The Eden project, a lot of work on actually have standardized health data, but also research using this real-world data. The IMI Get Real, already mentioned, real-world data and real evidence methods and use cases. And there are many other projects. So these are the projects, and we ensure that by having the lead partners from this project in Sustain, that we also can very quickly also see how these methods will link to the needs of the HTA bodies. So I would like to just to give you a few examples very quickly to see what kind of things we're going to do, with what we're going to do and what already has been done. So this is our results from work in the HX project, where we already tried to find out where are the challenges with HTA bodies. So where are actually their needs? So where do they look for new methods? So this was a study which was published a few years ago. And actually the outcome was, where are the issues? How often do you consider HTA of these health technologies complex? Well, as you can see, ATMPs, not very surprising. Histology-independent treatments, orphan therapy. So these are the kind of technologies HTA bodies struggle with to do good assessments. So there may be also new methods might actually help them. But we also did in HIC already some work on tools assessing quality of study, investigated health interventions using real-world data, a literature review, and content analysis. And what we did firstly to see, well, what are the kind of items you would like to look for if you look to real-world data? And how many tools are already available, and in which extent do these tools actually assess those elements? Well, you can see there are around 50 tools to do this. It's amazing. And when do we know which tool to use? Or do we actually want to use a combination of tools? Many of the tools, Robin's Eye or the tool from ISPI, there are many ones. And for outside groups, it's very hard to find out, well, what is the best tool? And we quite often also know that none of the tools will actually cover all domains which we have listed. So if you're interested, I think this is an interesting paper because it really gives an overview and also shows that many different tools are being used by many different institutions. This is one I like very much because it has quite recently accepted. That links a little bit more closely to the discussion we had earlier on. Well, what about comparing uncontrolled trials with external controls, real-world data? And what we did in the study was part of the Get Real work. Is that, well, what's in literature? What should you do? What is in the guidelines of the HTA bodies? And what do they really do if they do an assessment? Well, there's a big difference between that. You see that the guidelines as being prescribed by some of the HTA bodies and what's in literature still shows some alignments, but in the practical assessments, it's much harder to actually find out what they're doing. Also because they quite often have to deal with the data they get actually from the health technology developer. But this gives a little bit of indication on what they really like. As you can see, if you talk about uncontrolled trials with external controls, we always talk about unanchored comparisons. And then, as you can see, most bodies, if they prefer that, they would like to have individual patient data for the external controls and not aggregated data for external controls. Actually, there is not much appreciation of that. You see that most institutions are not very fond of doing these kind of comparisons. There are a few, well, in some instances like NICE, we might accept a matching and just indirect comparison or an STC, but most of them, also UNETA, ICWIC, and even HAS are very reluctant to actually go in that area. And also, well, we want to have these methods which are developed for individual data. Of course, no naive comparisons. As been discussed, no naive comparisons, no non-adjusted comparisons. But then again, you also see a lot of differences between which methods they think are the best to use if you do actually an unanchored comparison with individual patient data. So this also shows that we need to have more work on find really some alliance also over in Europe on which methods we think are most practical to use on a national level, but also as part of the EU HCR. And I think this, if you're interested, this study is available online and provides more detail on the comparison between guidelines, literature, and actual assessments. Few other examples. This is from the Impact HTA, where they looked at methodologies, costing methodologies for economic evaluations, and what's going on in the different guidelines. This is one about surrogate endpoints in health technology assessments, mostly focused on medical devices. So as you can see, there's already a lot of work there, a lot of studies are there, and we really have to make use of what already has been developed in those projects. Of course, this project needs to actually provide some link to other initiatives. As I indicated, to the EU HCR coordination group and the subgroup, especially on methodology. So what we hope to do is providing knowledge that, for instance, may be used by the subgroup on methodology for updating their guidelines. We know these guidelines are just being reinstated, so they're quite fresh. But we would expect that in a few years, based on the new methods, there might be updates. And we think that we could actually provide a lot of input to these subgroups so that these guidelines will be updated. There's currently a tender to build capacity and knowledge for the implementation of the EU HCR. So it means that the Commission actually sent out an tender to say, well, what can we do to educate all the HCA bodies to actually do the training? And we say, well, we also do training in our project. Will be much more focused on what we call the new innovative HCA methods. And then, as you may be aware, the Commission also has actually provided money to a program called Technical Support Instrument, where individual countries can ask for additional budget to actually support, to help them with implementing the results from the EU HCR. And this is also about methods. So we also think that we can actually provide additional support to these projects, which are sometimes on an individual member state level, but then again, they might not have that expertise. So we also hope to provide input over there. So my final remarks is, sustained HA mission is to help understanding the needs of HA bodies and not to introduce an additional burden. So what we also try to find out, how can we work with the HA bodies without asking a lot of additional questions? I think we all know a lot of the HA bodies are resource constrained. I see in the Netherlands, it's already quite hard to do all the national assessments. And now we also have to do all these EU assessments. And now there's another club who wants to ask them for additional information. So we have to ensure that it really fits into the processes of these national HA bodies. I think it should provide a fair and well-balanced filter on all the new HA methods that are developed by academic groups, research initiatives, consultancy groups, and private groups. Where can we really ensure that we're balanced, that we're really taking into account what's going on, and that we're not driven by certain initiatives? And at the end, we hope to be a platform for all the EU HCA bodies, and that they can join us to support the future of HCA methodology. I think that's the last. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wim. Now we do have time for a panel discussion. So prepare your questions. I would also invite all the speakers here to the panel. And we do have Anna Wixton as well, I believe, if she's here. So please, all panelists, take a microphone, a seat, those who wish to be seated. And as we get ready here, I'll also very quickly introduce Anna. Anna gave a presentation yesterday. I'm not sure whether everyone was in the room, so too bad for those who were not here. Anna is a statistician with more than 15 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. She also holds a PhD in network meta-analysis, so she will also be able to talk about all these ITC things if needed. But in addition, she's a patient and presented yesterday as a patient representative and advocate, so very happy to have you here on the panel as well, Anna. I'm going to kick off the discussion with a few questions. Get ready, you will have time to ask your questions as well later on. So Wim, you talked about capacity building. And when I look at the space of HTA maturity across Europe, it's very, very heterogeneous. So we also heard about innovative methods from Antoine, etc. But is innovation actually the right question now? When you look at this heterogeneity across member states, do we need to build the capacity and just the basics first? Is actually innovation the wrong question at this point, and is capacity the thing we need to focus on?
I think that is an excellent question. I think we have also planned that the work we do in sustain HCA on education for more innovative methods might be not start from the beginning. And as I indicated, there's currently a tender which which was opened by the European Commission to actually firstly start to educate all the national HTA bodies how to do these joint assessments, but also how to implement these joint assessments in their practice. And I think that is probably the first thing we should do, because we are indeed quite aware that there are some HTA bodies which have a lot of expertise, but probably majority doesn't have it. So I think the focus will be there, but I think over 1 or 2 years, we should also think, well, what can we do more? And then also our education platform will come, and maybe firstly for the more advanced HTA bodies, but also at some moment also we should also share that kind of experience with HTA bodies which are less resourced and less experienced.
Yeah. So Anna, I would like to hand it over to you. You now have been hearing about these efforts to harmonize HTA in Europe, etc. Now, with your two hats as a statistician and as a patient, how do you see these activities? What do you think, or what would you comment in terms of the theme of innovation? Innovation comes with a lot of additional uncertainty. Yesterday, it was quite impressive when you described the different choices you had to make and sort of what reactions that may trigger. So what are your thoughts about these? Thinking about innovation and how can the European collaboration sort of help from a patient perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. So I was thinking about this a little bit from that perspective that as a patient, kind of if I think about indirect treatment comparisons and network meta-analysis, thanks. They are perhaps like this one, thanks. Yeah, yeah. So they might not be so. I mean, even if I understand the methods, which of course most of the patients don't, they are not so interesting because it's kind of difficult to have too many choices. So I would leave here the use of those for the medical professionals. But then there I see them as really, you know, a lot of opportunities to better inform the doctors, to inform the patients, and make kind of, yeah. And as a patient, I mean, it's kind of when you are in that situation making the decision, it's at the end difficult if you have too many choices, and then also like it might be that I don't care too much that if the number is for 50% response rate or 55 because it's kind of similar. but when you treat a lot of patients, then it of course matters.
Of course, the perspective is different. Thank you so much, Anna. Lara, you mentioned in your presentation you are heading one of the biggest, I think probably by far the biggest team of HTA statisticians in the industry. You need to know what this team is going to be doing or what the requests are going to be. So you need to have sort of clarity and predictability. But at the same time, we want innovation, and innovation comes with lots of unknowns, etc. So we want, on one hand, predictability, but we also want the flexibility to use all these innovative and novel approaches when we think they are needed. So how do you balance these two things, the predictability need, but also the need for flexibility?
I think that's a really interesting challenge. And I think the short answer is that if life were easy, it wouldn't be interesting. That, you know, to a certain extent, we all want to be able to know what the right decision is, right? And we're all afraid when it comes to planning, right? We're afraid of making the wrong decisions. What if I predict the wrong PICA? What if I say, I don't think that PICA is going to happen, we're not planning for it, and then that turns out to be the most important one? I don't want to make that mistake. But nor do I want to prepare for 15 PICOs that end up being irrelevant. But at the same time, there's uncertainty in this. And part of what we have to do is to learn to be uncomfortable with uncertainty and to manage it. And to also start to say that, so you're going to have these, you get these two paradigms in corporate organizations in general, whether they're academic institutions or government institutions or pharmaceutical development organizations. You'll have people who want to know that there's a recipe book that I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this, and I get the right answer. And there's other people who are sitting there saying, no, I'm uncomfortable with, I'm going to do this step, and then I'm going to see what happens. And so we're trying to find that balance in this space. We all want to do the right thing here. And at the end of the day, everyone is sort of aiming towards the same goal, which is, how do we get the right information to make the right decisions? It's not easy. And so for us, it within the statistical teams that I manage, a lot of it's going to be about trying to look at the history of what's happening, look at the trends that are happening today, and to say, okay, what do we think is most likely to happen? Let's plan for that. What are the things that have the highest sort of rate of return on investment? There's certain analyses we'll be able to do where if we have to pivot and do them, they're easy. And there's others where if you have to pivot and do it, they're hard, right? And Antonio did a really great job of explaining some of those dilemmas. And so a lot of it's going to be about saying, okay, how important is it? How hard is it? How complex is it? And where do I put the finite resources I have? But at the end of the day, that's the big problem, is that even with artificial intelligence, we don't have the ability to do everything everywhere all at once. So we're going to have to prioritize, and we have to think about the framework that we use to do that. And to do that, we need to think about who the decision makers are. And those decision makers, at the end of the day, the real decision makers are the patients who we're trying to treat. But along the pathway, there are, it's interesting what Anna just said about, as a patient, you want some certainty. You want to know that your provider has actually synthesized the data and is making the recommendation that's best for you.
Yeah. I mean, or that would be the optimal case.
Yeah.
I might be still wanting to have kind of, or many patients want to do the final decision also themselves, some not. And then I think when things get really complicated, then it's kind of good if the doctor has been able to make and there it's important that they have kind of the data in a way, and then they can then communicate.
But like in an ideal world, there's some artificial intelligence machine that's synthesizing all the available data and saying, hey, there's 3 choices for you. They have some trade-offs, but these are the 3 choices that would be best for you. Which are the trade-offs you want to make? Right?
Yeah. I mean, is it coming from artificial intelligence or where is it coming?
Yeah.
I mean, as long as it's kind of something that I could trust the method, then that would be nice.
It should come from some sort of intelligence, absolutely.
Right. And
so
that's the issue. Can we do it in a way where people can trust the methods, trust the data, but also recognize that there's some uncertainty here. We don't have it all. So that's the planning element.
To manage that uncertainty, you mentioned learning from the past. And that gives a nice segue into a question I have to Antonio, actually. Antonio presented, all these fancy methods, really nice, and then they are so limited, so we need to go even beyond that. So you push towards a novel space, right? Methods which are even newer, so we will have limited experience. So there are the uncertainties associated with maybe the limited data, whatnot, but there's also uncertainty associated with sort of lack of standards, best practices, etc. So what can we offer, say, from the industry if we are promoting novel methods to manage that uncertainty, sort of to mitigate these additional elements associated with pushing for innovation?
Sure. So that's a great question. In my talk, I mentioned that the new methods, they had increased researcher degrees of freedom and increased complexity. And I think that a simple solution to improve transparency there is the definition of a pre-specified statistical analysis plan that is dedicated specifically to HTA and HEOR market access objectives. However, I think that this depends on there being some predictability on some workable PICOs that we might find later on in the process. And that requires engaging very early on with the HTA bodies and there being a system in place where the HTA bodies are open to consultation, as happens in the regulatory process. And I think that's a challenge. That's from the HTA body's perspective. And I think from the pharmaceutical company's perspective, I think that it's essential to have a HTA statistician that is dedicated specifically to HTA. And some pharmaceutical companies have that within clinical development. Others have it within the more commercial or market access function. In both cases, if you have it in clinical development, it's difficult to interact with those that are in the commercial or market access challenge function. On the other hand, if you're in market access, it's difficult to interact with clinical development. I think the HTA statistician there needs to be a channel for going to market access and seeing what are the PICOs that we might require, global and local market access, and then channel that to the clinical development team at the trial design stage. And I think that once we explain the modeling choices that we have made on a transparent analysis plan, they will become easier to justify.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So that brings me to another question. You mentioned this sort of joint scientific consultation, and Wim is part of the UHA coordination group subgroup on joint scientific consultation. Now, I've sort of a question on one hand to Wim, but also I realize there are a few regulators still in the room, which we are very happy about. If you're willing to comment, please then feel free to comment as well. How do you think, Wim, is European HTA going to change the coordination, collaboration, the relationship between the HTA bodies and the regulators in the member states?
Well, I think because of the whole project, I think that kind of collaboration will be much more intensive on all stages. So, for instance, I'm part of the subgroup on joint scientific consultation. So currently we're thinking how this process will actually look like and how this will be parallel with the regulator. And I think most of the HTA bodies believe that the most efficient way to do this is not alone, but really parallel with the regulators. So we're really trying to formulate a kind of format in which we do it, which is really aligned. Of course, we have different remits. We always have to ensure that we have different remits, but there's a lot of overlap in the questions which we have. So we should really ensure that for the joint scientific consultations, this process is as aligned as possible. And then I think also in the JCAs, you can see that the whole process is linked to the regulatory process. So there will be many moments of interaction. And again, I think that I'm also a little bit cautious because some think, well, this can all come together. They don't think so. But at least you should ensure that where you can actually align, that you should do it. And I think both in the JCA as well in the GSC, I think we're currently working on that. And even with the medical devices, which I remember, we see that, for instance, there are the expert panels, which are currently coordinated by EMA on the medical devices. There also some form of scientific consultation is being developed. And also there, HTA bodies trying to align so that we ensure that we do it at the same time point. And I think officially we also have the option of an HTA-only joint scientific consultation. But I think most of us would really propose to do this as much as possible. Only if companies ask for an HTA-only joint scientific consultation, it's possible. But we will also urge companies just to do it parallel. We think it's much more efficient and also give more aligned recommendations, I think, to the manufacturer.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to open it to the room to ask questions, but also comment on statements that have been made. Anders?
Yeah, Anders Gård Rasmussen, Novo Nordisk. I think this is a question for Wim. Now I saw at least on a number of your slides you had industry mentioned as well. I think something that is maybe sometimes also frustrating to industry statisticians when working with HTA is that there are, you could say, more limited opportunities also for engagement and you could say scientific dialogue that's not very product focused. And I think you also highlighted the fact that some of this has to do with simply a lack of capacity at an HTA body side. I mean, they don't have the time and they don't have, the expert groups that Kit was speaking to yesterday that's sitting in the EMA where you have, 200 experts that you can tap into. So how do you see the opportunities also for having more scientific dialogue also with industry, a little bit inspired also by the session that we're at here today, where I think we have a great presence from EMA and from regulators. How can we do something similar also with HTA bodies, being mindful also, of course, of the limitations and the lack of capacity at the moment?
Yeah, I think that has always been a kind of sensitive argument. I think there is a perception even more with HTA bodies because we're very close to kind of recommendation which leads to reimbursement, which is so that there has to be some form of independency. That's crucial to what we do. So if that's your starting point, then again you think, yeah, yes, of course, discussion with the health technology developer is important, but there are certain limits to that, where and how. So we try to formalize that, and I think that compared to 5 to 10 years ago, I think it's already much more formalized in many countries, and also we will provide these opportunities through the EU HTA regulation, but there will be always some limits, and we have to find out how we can do this efficient, because the other thing you already mentioned are the resources. If I, for instance, see my organization in Zin, we really don't have any resources to do joint scientific consultations. Really, we don't. Because all the work goes currently into the national assessments. And we got like 10 new people over the last 2 years, and that's already a lot for us. So I think there's really an issue over there that we have to find a balance between, I always say, the talking and the working. And we also have to produce advices. So I think that there will be always sometimes hard to really have continuous interactions like you have with regulatory agencies.
I think we have here a question.
Yeah, thank you. David Wright, AstraZeneca. Just a question to Lara about stats analysis plans. So 5 years before you are going to go to the HTAs, you might start a trial, and so you can write something down. And then 2 years later, you know that your competitor has got an indication, or maybe 3 years or 4 years. And so before you actually file, before that dramatic period that you were talking about, you do have some information. So can you talk a little bit about how the stats analysis plan could evolve over that period, rather than, because clearly it's not feasible to know everything at 5 years before, and it's not going to cause the regulators too much concern as long as the integrity of the trial is not compromised by this stats analysis plan. Mm-hmm.
I think that is not just a good question, but it's the critical question, because we have a paradigm today that says you design a trial and you pivot. Typically, you pivot the design of that trial because of things that are happening internal to that trial, right? So you have data monitoring committees who might make recommendations about changing something about the way the trial is conducted because of something that's happening inside that trial. But when we first designed that trial, we do look at the access environment and what's the current standard of care. We've picked the treatment. We try to look at who are the patients who are supposed to be treated with this drug, get a representative sample. The question becomes now, how do we pivot those designs midstream? And part of it is, it's just the way our world is changing, that 50 years ago, the number of different treatments available was much more limited. The number of treatments available today is not only much vaster, but it's changing really fast. And so one of the questions becomes to say that, okay, this was my patient access plan and how I was going to try to dissect the data or analyze the data, given the trial design, given the state of the world at the time the trial was launched. But I also need to think about building in contingency plans for how I might pivot some of this trial and actually adjust even that regulatory design aspect or some of the data collection if certain circumstances change. Now, some of this you can actually think about it. It's not a comfortable place for us right now I think in industry, because it's not the typical clinical development paradigm. But if you look at the competitive landscape, all the trials are registered on clinicaltrials.gov. You know what is theoretically coming. You can be monitoring it. You can be pivoting. And then you have to be asking yourself the question of, okay, when I design a trial, one of the things that everyone has in mind is the patient. We're asking them to make a sacrifice to be in that trial. And so we want to limit their exposure. We want to limit the number of patients that have to participate to exactly the number that need to. We want to do the trial as fast as we can because we want to get a valuable treatment to patients. So now we have the question of, okay, where are the pivots that I can answer through analyzing the data differently? Where are the pivots that say I have to change the way I'm collecting the data? And to do this, you kind of have to lay the groundwork up front, some scenario planning to say, okay, these are the things that are highly likely to happen where I might be prepared to pivot. These are the things that I'm just going to have to accept as consequences because I can't do everything. And so, but a lot of it is about the fact that we're working in a cross-functional environment, that different functions within a pharmaceutical company have to make different kinds of decisions, and they have to understand the consequences of those decisions and look at the trade-offs. I think, this is where Sandra mentioned, we have one of the largest HTA stat groups in the industry because we partition some of these things between what the regulatory statisticians do versus what we're doing for HTA and access. But at the end, we have to bring it all back together because they're not truly independent. And so there's different models that different companies use in doing this. But at the end of the day, it comes back to that scenario planning, monitoring the environment, and deciding what's a pivot in an analysis plan, what's a pivot in data collection, and what's a pivot in understanding what your target populations are going to be and how you handle patient access at the end of the day. But there's all these multidimensional trade-offs. And so there's no one-size-fits-all answer other than good planning up front and planning for discussions, either based at time points or based on external events happening.
Good. We're going to stay at this side and then Lila will be second. Okay.
Paul, thank you very much for excellent and very informative presentations. Antonio, you've touched a great deal on a certain methodology with regards to indirect comparison that we also as regulators have challenges with. So I very much welcome your clear explanation about the different approaches. And now moving on to sustain HTA, I was really impressed by the collaborative efforts that you've managed to set up. And I think as regulators, perhaps we could learn something from this initiative. And if you would mind just sharing with us what are the learnings from you, your experience in setting up such initiative, because I think it's probably the way forward in a world with finite resources. We want independence, but we also want to not duplicate the effort in trying to address methodological needs versus knowledge gap. Thank you.
I don't know if I really have to respond to that, but thank you for that. I think that we also look a lot to regulators, because I think that in terms of collaboration, you are of course many years ahead, and actually for us it's important to see how this has been developing, because we feel that the coming years will be hard. And I think if we have the discussion about PICOs, I think we all should very closely look what will happen over the years. So in terms of number of PICOs, number of relevant PICOs, what are we going to do in terms of consolidation? And I've seen a few of those PICOs, and personally I think that sometimes some PICOs are very close. So I said, well, why shouldn't be separate PICOs? And I think there is a kind of, in some countries, sensitivity to really say, well, this is our PICO, so we want to have that on the table. I can imagine that at some moment, based on the experiences which we have, we will be able to consolidate much stronger than we do now. I hope so, because otherwise in the future it won't be workable. So we have to manage, but I think we have to be inclusive in the beginning, because that's the reason we do this in this way. Because if we would already slim down the PICOs from the beginning, some countries would say, oh, this is not helpful for my country, so we're going to do our own national assessment. And this is not what we want. But I hope that based on the experiences, and maybe we should also, with all stakeholders together, share that experiences, we can consolidate much more, and at the end have a few PICOs, which are in essence the most relevant ones. But I think that's something we have to learn over the coming years.
Now, Lila, please.
Lila Viscala from
can I make a
J&J.
comment on this?
Sorry.
Antonio, can you just comment on, add on that very
No,
quickly?
just very quickly replying to Kadia, and thank you very much for the positive feedback. But just to say that there is a lot of overlap between the unanchored comparison and the externally controlled single-arm trial, and that regulators could learn from the HTA guidance and vice versa. But there are also two additional considerations. One is whether subject-level data is available or not, which might differ in the different contexts, and also the target population. From the perspective of a single-arm trial, usually in a regulatory perspective, you produce your treatment effect estimates in the single-arm study sample or population, whereas in HTA, you might make a case that the real-world data set or the external control is more representative for decision-making. So that is your target. But there are many analogies, and I think that HTA and regulatory statisticians can definitely interact and learn from their experiences there. And thank you.
Now we go to Lila.
So my experience has been maybe following what Antonio was saying, that the ITCs are creeping up into the, let's say, the continuum and more present in the regulatory dossiers. And also those ITCs that were present in the regulatory dossiers then are very successful also for the HTA bodies, because they've already seen them being submitted to regulatory. So maybe I think that's an opportunity. So that the question to Antonio, maybe following what you were already saying, in terms maybe on the methodology, an opportunity to maintain consistency between the tools that are being used in the regulatory part and the tools that are being used in the HTA part, to kind of lean in and kind of borrow strength from what has happened before and needs to happen with the HTA piece. So that's one thing. And second, for Laura, maybe naming the elephant in the room, can we learn more from the estimate conversation that we had in the last 2 days and kind of transfer that in the PICOS discussion? Is that anything that we can actually borrow strength again from one to the other?
Absolutely. I think, you know, in the HTA SIG, we've had a lot of discussions about this, and I feel like Anders should answer this more than me, but a PICO is a form of an estimand, right? You're defining the estimand you're looking for. I think the challenge here that we have is that we're defining a different estimand than the regulatory estimand. And that's not an unreasonable thing to do, because it's a different question. But I think the estimand framework needs to be a critical part of the statistical analysis plans that people are developing. I think one of my observations, and I'm actually going to flip your question back to Wim, and don't freak out about estimands, but it actually goes to the concept of why an estimand is so valuable, because an estimand, the estimand framework is basically forcing you to clarify all of the underlying assumptions about what it is that you're producing. And one of my observations about, so something that is very often done in the HTA space, but not in the regulatory space, is an extensive amount of a regression analysis of utilities. So it's not very relevant in the HTA, in the regulatory context, but it's hugely relevant in the HTA context. There's a lot of missing data in the utility framework. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that if you look across a bunch of different dossiers, even within the same, even submitted to the same agency, there are hidden assumptions in those utility regressions about how people have handled missing data that they're not revealing. And so one of my questions is like, don't you think the S-demand framework will help you in the sense of making sure that people are comparing apples to apples when they're looking at different dossiers, because it forces you to clarify all the assumptions?
Yes, I think that's hard, especially from an agency. We have been historically, in the Netherlands at least, focused a lot on cost effectiveness. But I have always thought it was interesting that even if I saw files from submission files from a company where we have both a clinical effectiveness part and a cost effectiveness part, that the approach is very different. So the uncertainties we allow in the cost effectiveness, we do not allow in the clinical effectiveness part. And I have always said, why? But at some moment for people which are a little bit more in the clinical effectiveness part, this is very different. While from the economic evaluation side, these kind of uncertainties are just accepted because you're going to show the sensitivities. You're going to do a probabilistic sensitivity analysis. So you know how wide your estimation is. And this is a very different approach from what your suggestion. And I struggle about that, how you can actually bring this more closely together.
Now I think we do have questions online as well, right?
I also, can I answer to Lila's question? Okay. Essentially, I think we're in a rare situation where some HTA guidance for unanchored comparisons has been available even earlier than the regulatory guidance. The HTA guidance is very strict with unanchored comparisons. However, at the end of the day, the externally controlled single-arm trials are being used for regulatory approval. Rare diseases, diseases with high unmet need, for ethical reasons. And an HTA decision is eventually going to be required with the data that we have available, even if the design is suboptimal. So if there is an openness from the regulatory standpoint to take in those designs, then I think that from the HTA perspective, maybe there should be as well.
So what kind of designs do you mean?
Externally controlled single-arm trials.
Yeah, but again, I think because just the slide I showed you, I think that within HTA bodies, I think there is some willingness to think about comparison of external controls to single-arm trials if we talk about individual patient data. I think there is, at least if there may be some cases in where it might be very hard to do an ST. But again, I think we are much more reluctant to go to what we see now, all these aggregated data and MIC analysis. We do, because as you say, we have to make a decision. But at the end, at some moment, we might say, no, we're not going to accept it anymore. Because we know that if we advise in a joint scientific consultation, for instance, well, we know you're going to do a single-arm trial, already think about how you're going to include your external controls. And maybe think about a target trial emulation approach in which you link the external controls to the single-arm trial. And I think there are better approaches thinkable than what we see now. And I think my kind of outreach to regulatory say, well, where can we find that alliance that we ensure that we at least do the best we can do, and not the kind of things we see now at the HTA level.
That we need to get better on that theme. I think we have heard not just us. We quickly go to the online question, sorry for that, and then we come back to that side. I see at least 3 people raising their hand.
Okay, thank you, Sandro. So there was a question in the chat, and it's really about the multiplicity issues we have with a number of PICOs. And we heard about consolidation of PICOs. We heard about pre-specification in the talks. And so how do we know the difference between spurious and true results? And what can we do as statisticians to manage the tension between informing about the PICO that the HTA body wants to see and also applying the statistical rigor we have to do to differentiate between those? I don't know, Laura, if you want to start, because you talked a lot about pre-specification SAPs.
So I will start by just saying that in one talk I've given, somebody helped me use the Bart Simpson comic generator to generate a little comic that said, not all PICOs will be feasible. And so Wim said something earlier about that we have to respect the prerogative of all of the European member states to say, this is the PICO I'm interested in. We also have a responsibility as statisticians as drug developers and as HTA assessors to acknowledge when the data to answer the question just isn't there. And sometimes we just have to say, it's not that the question was invalid, it's that it wasn't the question we're prepared to answer. And so one of the things that we need, and that's part of the pre-specification, is saying, predefining what are the criteria that make a PICO analyzable given the available data and information. We have to get there. I think between FSPI as an organization of statisticians, between academics, between working with Sustain HTA, we do need to get to some standards that say there are certain analyses that probably should not be done, right? That even though the question is asked, sometimes you have to say, given the data we have, we can't answer it. Now, that's the easy part, right? Because it's going to be really easy to say, hey, if I only have 8 patients who met the definition of that population, I do not have enough data to answer this question. That's the easy part. The harder part is what happens when I'm asked, when I run a trial of 20,000 patients and I'm asked to break it up in 50 different ways. There's enough patients to break it up, but you're going to see the spurious relations. There's the famous data from 2002 of people analyzing, I think it was studies on aspirin's effectiveness in preventing heart attacks. And if you were born under, I think the signs of Libra and Gemini, it didn't work for you, but any other astrological signs, it works fine. How many people believe that your astrological sign is actually correlated with the biological effect of a drug? Not many. You will find these spurious things. And so part of that then goes to education. And I hope groups like Sustain HTA help with that education. But statisticians in general have to help people understand, okay, a lot of these analyses we're going to do in the HTA space are not we're treating them as hypothesis testing. We're using methods that are typically used to test hypotheses, but we're actually not. They're suggestive. And so there's different techniques we can use. The field of statistical analysis, particularly classical frequentist statistical analysis, is a framework we all know, we're familiar with it. But it tells us that we're bringing in uncertainty that is due to randomness. That's mostly what we're getting there. We're now adding a component, a way of breaking down the data where we're bringing in other sources of uncertainty, but we're not quantifying them. And so the question is, can we build a framework for doing that? Because just adding multiplicity adjustments is still based on the idea that you're adjusting for the randomness, and that has to do with how you designed the trial, how you collected the data. Here we've got uncertainty that's being introduced because of how we're asking the questions. And so, the Bayesian frameworks introduce some things like this. There's stuff in risk analysis that introduces frameworks like that. But we might have to rethink that issue of how we get that understanding of we're bringing in new sources of uncertainty here. And so we have to understand that this is directional information, but it's not definitive information when we do that kind of breakdown.
So time's running. I know that at least two people are already here since quite a while, so I think we should just allow these questions as well, but try to have quick questions and answers, and then we'll draw it to a close.
Thanks, Florian Lasch, EMA. I would like to come back to the connection between the HTA statistics and the regulatory statistics. And first of all, I truly believe that's a kind of false dichotomy and that there is overlap. But I would not focus so much on the licensing decision on the regulatory side. I think there we have kind of established standards, and kind of the indirect comparison methodology is not something that I would explore kind of as a default in that area. But there are decisions on the regulatory side that very much would benefit from the methodology that is developed in the HTA space. And that is for orphan maintenance decisions. So if you want to get the orphan designation and then you maintain it at the point of marketing authorization, oftentimes you need to show a significant benefit over competitors. And that's where I think the methodology that's traditionally used in the HTA space can be of very much benefit. And I would actually kind of make a plea for better collaboration within the same company between the different departments, because the HTA statisticians will be the experts with regards to that specific methodology. And that's also something that we see for conditional marketing authorizations, where you need to demonstrate a major therapeutic advantage if there's already another product in the same indication. And again, lacking head-to-head trials to all the possible comparators, indirect comparison methodology becomes very much important. But these are questions asked in the regulatory, kind of on the regulatory side. And I think that's where I would kind of focus first in building collaboration within the company and also kind of on the regulatory side. So between HTA bodies and regulatory bodies.
I fully agree. And if I can add two additional examples, one where a meta-analytical methodology is used to determine the non-inferiority margin of active controlled trial. That's also another one which I think is very valuable. And then the anchor indirect comparison case, when there is a common control, is very similar to the generalizability or transportability of randomized trials case, because you're trying to transport the relative effect from one setting into the other, into another target population. So that's also where I think there can be a lot of overlap.
Good. As time is running, last question, and then we're going to a close.
Hi everyone. So this is about the estimate thinking and PICO selection as it's mentioned. I was a bit confused that writing statistical analysis plan before this PICO specified, meaning the question itself. So the very quick question, is it transparent or will it be transparent, this PICO selection made by HTA to the drug developers, so HTA statistician can more confidently specify the estimator or the analysis plan? Yeah.
So Anya Scheel is not here, but I'm going to channel her for a moment. She says PICOs should not be a surprise. That if you look at clinical treatment guidelines, if you look at current reimbursement pathways, you can make a pretty good guess at what are the populations, what are the comparators. And then if you look at the guidelines of different HTA agencies and you look at the EU HTA guidance, you can look at the outcome measures that they're going to be interested in. So you should be able to anticipate it and guess at it. You always have the theoretical option, given capacity for bilateral HTA advice to try to understand what that would be. But it goes to, somebody made a plea for better cross-functional collaboration. Medical affairs colleagues, market access colleagues, people who work at the country level, they will be able to tell you this information and feed it through. So you should be able to anticipate it, monitor it. And that's part of your planning exercise, is to keep an eye on it and say, given a PICO, here's the estimand I would use. Some of those PICOs will not come to reality. They'll fall out in the consolidation processes. Others will make it through. But in theory, there shouldn't be too many PICOs that come as surprises. That's what Anya would say if she was here, I think. Would she?
Yeah, I think I would fully support that. Because we, of course, also as a national HTA body, have close contacts with the affiliates and national affiliates of the companies. And we exactly say that it's also up to them to inform the central, the European headquarters to what are the most important factors to take in account, at least for the PICOs for our country. But I think that all countries, the same thing will happen. So I totally agree. Yeah.
Good. With that, I think the discussion shows that we could continue for a long time. Yeah. We will definitely, maybe not today in that room, but definitely at other platforms, other occasions. And just a very big thank you to all of the speakers and panelists. With that, back to Helen.
Me too. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I hope you can hear me. It's very loose. So now the 9th FSPI Regulatory Statistics Workshop has come to an end. I hope you all enjoyed the meeting and the great discussions, and also took the opportunities to network. And I hope you also liked our experiments. I'm pretty sure we will try to experiment again next year. I would really like to thank all of the speakers, the panelists, the chairs, the poster contributors, and also the audience for taking the time to engage in this workshop.